I'm Manuel Partiès from Institut de Recherche en Cancérologie de Montpellier in France, and I'm going to give this first lecture in a series of 5 on radiopharmaceutical dosimetry. This project and this work has been done under the IAEA Technical Cooperation Program with Project POL 9025. The first lecture is the Introduction to Radiopharmaceutical Dosimetry. Nuclear medicine dosimetry, as we know it, is mostly a specialty of diagnostic. According to EINM surveys in 2006, 2012, and more recent, about 90% of nuclear medicine is diagnostics. And then therapy represents more or less 10% of nuclear medicine application, even though it's a growing specialty. For many years, therapy was mostly involved in the therapy of thyroid pathologies, both cancer and non-cancer pathologies. But more recently, we could see appearing different specialties like radioimmunotherapy, peptide receptor radionuclide therapy, bone pain palliation agents, etc., etc. In addition to these targeted radionuclide therapy, where a vector is attached to an isotope and injected usually in a systemic way, selective internal radiotherapy appeared, where microspheres, usually of yttrium-90, but more recently of holmium-166, can be injected via the hepatic artery for the treatment of liver metastasis. So, in fact, for diagnostic procedure and for therapeutic procedure, the level of irradiation is not the same. For diagnostic procedure, there's a low amount of radiation involved, meaning that the only effect that can be seen are stochastic effects. Therefore, the dosimetry in that context apply mostly to patient radiation safety in order to enforce the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable in terms of irradiation delivered to the patient. For therapeutic procedure, it's not the same because, first of all, the effects that can be observed are deterministic effects, and they are intended to appear because there will be a concentration of radiation at the level of the tumor in such a level that the tumor is destructed. Then obviously, as in any therapy involving ionizing radiation, one issue is to maintain the irradiation to normal critical organ at-risk tissues under a threshold in order to avoid side effects. And then quite often now, the principle for administration could be defined as AHASA, meaning inject the activity as high as safely attainable. But we discuss that later in a further lecture. The goals are not the same for diagnostic and therapy, and therefore the accuracy for dosimetry is not the same. For diagnostic, an order of magnitude of the irradiation delivered will be enough. For therapy, we're looking for the best possible accuracy. Obviously, we're not at a stage yet when we can reach an accuracy equivalent to that seen in external beam radiotherapy. However, these dosimetric studies can be involved with different goals, different objectives. The first one is to establish comparative studies and to compare how the therapy is being delivered between different centers. Also, especially at the European level, dosimetry can be a legal requirement according, for example, to Euratom directive. Then it's also a matter of documenting the therapeutic procedure. A further point, I'm citing this as sort of increasing order of refinement and complexity, is to implement dosimetry for targeted radionuclide therapy optimization. The objective here may be to change the posology, to adjust the posology to the patient in order to optimize the procedure. And that's exactly what the Euratom directive is actually intending. A third point, which seems to be quite important, is patient follow-up. It has to be bear in mind that these patients may have very slow evolving disease, or that therapy is quite efficient, in which case they can come back for another pathology that requires, for example, external beam radiotherapy. In which case, the first thing the radiation oncologist will ask is, that patient benefited from therapy involving ionizing radiation in nuclear medicine. What is the absorbed dose that was delivered and where, in order to allow me to plan the therapy with external beam. So as a consequence, the dosimetry procedure will depend on the objective and will depend on the domain, diagnostic or therapy. In fact, even though you can see that there are different domains of application, there is one main scheme, one main formalism for radiopharmaceutical dosimetry that is applied, and that is that of the MERD committee. So MERD stands for Medical Internal Radiation Dose Committee. It's a standing committee of the Society of Nuclear Medicine, so the North American Society of Nuclear Medicine. It's a mixed group of physicians and physicists, and has produced since 1968 to now 26 pamphlets, 20 dose estimate reports, and 3 books. The main achievement is a global formalism for absorbed dose calculation in nuclear medicine, even though we'll see later that they also produce dosimetric data for use in clinical dosimetry. So we're going to go very quickly through the MERD pamphlet. We've seen there's 26 of them, so obviously we don't want to know them by heart. But I think it's very important just to see the evolution of the poles of interest of the MERD committee a long time. Number one is really describing the methodology, a scheme for absorbed dose calculation for biologically distributed radionuclide. But look at the second one, energy deposition in water for photons from isotropic point sources. That really is a physicist pamphlet. You have point sources of photon, monoenergetic photons in water emitted isotropically. So this leads to the third one, absorbed dose for photon dosimetry, again, physicist. Pamphlet 4, pamphlet 6 is radionuclide decay scheme and nuclear parameters. These give the effective the physical half-life, the energy emitted, the percentage of particle emitted per decay for the given isotopes for use in nuclear medicine. So the difference between the 4th and the 6th is that it's been updated to give account of more isotopes of interest in nuclear medicine. Pamphlet 5 is interesting because you can see here, estimate of absorbed fraction, and we'll come back at large on this concept because it's a very important one, for monoenergetic photon sources, okay, still physics, but uniformly distributed in various organs of heterogeneous phantom. So these two keywords, heterogeneous phantoms and organs, are very important because we're closing to the human anatomy here. By heterogeneous phantom, what is intended is in fact a phantom where the density is realistic enough and gives account of density in soft tissue, bones, lungs, and surrounding air. And the various organs are the organs of human anatomy. Pamphlet 7 is the first one that speaks of electron and beta. 8, absorbed fraction for photon emitting radioactivity. So that's the first keyword here of radioactivity, is no longer monoenergetic sources. 9 probably should not be there because it really looks like those estimate report. We'll see that later. 10 is like the 4 and the 6, radionuclide decay schemes. 11 is a turning point in the formalism. It presents dosimetric data as values, absorbed dose per unit accumulated activity for different isotopes and different organs. In fact, it's quite a thick folder of values, and some of the values are still being used these days, from 1975 to these days. The results of MERD pamphlet number 11 are still used. After this, we could see some refinement. Kinetic models for absorbed dose calculation, specific absorbed fraction for photons distributed in the heart or in the heart wall of heterogeneous phantoms. So there's a differentiation between the heart content and the heart wall. 14th, dynamic urinary bladder. And then a silence until 1999, where 3 pamphlets were published in a row. The first one is as values in a revised model of adult head and brain, which probably corresponds to the advent of PET and for brain, because of a better resolution of PET, it is possible to define subregions in the brain, then it became interesting to define, to better address dosimetry. And that's exactly what that pamphlet is doing. 16 is a major pamphlet because it's also another turning point. If you're looking backward, up to the pamphlet 15 included, all the MERD pamphlet were involved in absorbed dose calculation. So defining absorbed fraction, seeing how the emitted energy from one source could be absorbed in a target, etc. The MERD pamphlet 16 is the first one that describes how the activity present in the body can be quantified. So these techniques for quantitative radiopharmaceutical biodistribution data acquisition and analysis for use in human radiation estimates is a major pamphlet in the sense that is now the MERD committee accepts to address all the aspects of radiopharmaceutical dosimetry, from the determination of activity to the absorbed dose calculation itself. 17 is a pamphlet on the dosimetry of non-uniform activity distribution at the voxel level. So this is an important one in the sense that it's now clear that thanks to SPECT or PET, it is possible in principle to get the activity at the voxel level, and therefore it is needed to get the absorbed dose also at the voxel level. 18, cumulative activity ventilation studies. 19 is is presenting a new model of kidney, and what for, and we're going to see here. 20, effect of model assumption on kidney dosimetry, so that's related to the 19th. In response, implication for radionuclide therapy. This pamphlet 20 in 2008, that is not that long ago, is the first one that explicitly mentions radionuclide therapy. Then 21 is a new nomenclature. We'll briefly discuss this. 22, alpha particle emitter for therapy. 23, quantitative SPECT. So again, quantification of activity in internal radionuclide therapy. 24, guideline for iodine SPECT dosimetry, iodine 131. So that's also therapy. MERD cell, so that's dosimetry at the cellular level. 26 is the first joint ENM MERD guideline for quantitative SPECT with lutetium-177 for therapy. So in fact, all the recent pamphlets since 2008 have been dedicated to radiopharmaceutical dosimetry in the context of therapy. And I think that's a major point to consider. Most of the work of the dosimetry committee started in the context of nuclear medicine dosimetry in diagnostics. And then now most of the work of the MERD committee in conjunction with the ENM dosimetry committee is made in the context of therapy. The dose estimate reports are tables of absorbed dose per megabecquerel of activity administered to a patient for a sort of a reference patient, a reference examination in diagnostics. So you can see that for most radiopharmaceutical present on the market, these dose estimate reports were published by the MERD committee. You also have to realize, because it's an important point, that because we can have different vectors for the same isotope, you can have several dose estimate reports for the same isotope, but a different radiopharmaceutical. And then the books. The MERD primer is the one that describes the MERD formalism. The MERD radionuclide data and decay scheme is in fact not only regrouping the pamphlets 4, 6, 10, but in fact much more data. I think there's 300 isotopes that are being considered. And then MERD cellular S values for those involved in preclinical studies. In fact, I would say that that one is very important in a nuclear medicine department, even though that book is in fact a subset of the ICRP 107 report on isotope decay data and decay scheme. And since that ICRP 107 can be downloaded freely, I would obviously advise you to download it. So, the formalism, according to the Merck Primer of 1991, consider a source of radiation that emits particles of energy E0 isotropically in an homogeneous medium. This means that the absorbed energy at a distance from a point source is only a matter of a distance between the source and the target. So if in a small volume at a distance x from the emission point, the absorbed energy is E, one can define the absorbed fraction phi x E0 as the ratio of E, the absorbed energy in the small volume, by E0, the emitted energy. An important point to consider is that the absorbed fraction, being energy divided by energy, is dimensionless. It's even more than that. It's a parameter that varies between 0 and 1, meaning that it's a very informative parameter. If for a reason someone says that in a given context the absorbed fraction is 0, you know immediately that none of the emitted energy is absorbed in the volume you're interested in. Then if the absorbed energy is 1, you know that for that situation, all of the emitted energy is absorbed. But obviously, you may want to compare different absorbed fraction in a context of different media, in which case you will divide the absorbed fraction by the mass dm of a small volume in which the energy is absorbed. So that capital phi x E0 is the specific absorbed fraction, is usually expressed in gram minus 1, or it could be expressed in kilogram minus 1. The absorbed dose definition, as we know, the absorbed dose is the energy absorbed divided by the mass of the volume where the energy is absorbed. And so it's the emitted energy E0 multiplied by the absorbed fraction divided by the mass, or simply the emitted energy multiplied by the specific absorbed fraction. And so this is the mean absorbed dose, and that's in gray, so joule per kilogram. This is obtained without simplifying hypothesis. So obviously one can imagine that the hardest part in this is to get a correct specific absorbed fraction. It's all the most important as we know, in nuclear medicine, the administration is usually made by in a systemic way, and therefore the radiopharmaceutical distributes in the body. So we have to define source volumes and target volumes. And so this is how the nomenclature presents the calculation. So the average absorbed dose in the target from the source, and that is how we should say it, is the absorbed energy E divided by the mass mk of a target, or the emitted energy multiplied by the absorbed fraction divided by the mass, or the emitted energy multiplied by the specific absorbed fraction from the source to the target. And this D is the mean absorbed dose over the target volume, and the target being K. So a very important point is that of penetrating or non-penetrating radiation. As we can see, we understand that photons deliver their energy on a long distance as compared to electrons or even alpha particle or Auger emitters. Therefore, if for a reason the irradiation is localized, one can say that the emitted energy is locally absorbed. That defines non-penetrating radiation for this volume and that type of radiation. So it's very important to realize that the concept of penetrating or non-penetrating radiation depends on organ size and particle range. In fact, most of radiopharmaceutical dosimetry is a matter of establishing the relationship between particle range and organ of a volume of interest. In which case, we can write, according to the Merck formalism, that the absorbed fraction is equal to 1 when source and targets are the same, or the absorbed fraction is 0 when source and targets are different. And therefore, the calculation of the absorbed dose is very easy because it's just the emitted energy divided by the mass of a target when source and target are the same, or it's 0 when source and targets are different. I just want to emphasize a point that electrons and beta, the character non-penetrating or penetrating is not a characteristic of the radiation. It's always a characteristic of the radiation as a function of a given volume. For example, electrons and beta can be non-penetrating at the level of an organ. For example, here you can see the liver. Since for iodine 131, for example, the beta range is about 1 millimeter. So it means that if you have an homogeneous distribution of beta in the liver, most of the energy will be absorbed in the liver. So you can safely assume that iodine 131 electrons or beta are non-penetrating for the liver. But if you consider a liver hepatic cell that has something like 20 micron diameter maybe, then the same iodine 131 radiation become penetrating radiation for that cell. So again, penetrating, non-penetrating radiation is not a characteristic of a radiation, it's a characteristic of a relationship between particle range and organ size. Then, up to now, we've been considering only E0, like the emitted energy, but we know that isotopes, when they decay, they emit different type of radiation with a different probability. So you can see here, technetium-99, and the emissions, and you got to the table in the right, the radiation type, electrons or gamma, and the energy in kV, and the radiation intensity in percentage. And in fact, the problem and the complexity of dosimetry in nuclear medicine will be to consider all these emissions. So in that context, for a given activity in the source at a time t, so that's AHT, in the absorbed dose rate at time t is the sum of the contribution of all particle type I, with Ni being the probability. So be careful, it's not the radiation intensity, it's a probability between 0 and 1. EI is the emitted energy in Joule, and capital phi I from the target to the source is the specific absorbed fraction. And as you can see, if the activity is in Becquerel, so that's disintegration per second, the energy is in Joule, the specific absorbed fraction in kilogram minus 1, so we end up with Gray divided by second, and that is an absorbed dose rate. This is the absorbed dose rate at a certain time t. But we know that we inject the product and then it scatters, distributes in the body, is it eventually washed away. So we have to integrate the absorbed dose rate in time. And that is what is presented in the first equation. So since this is the second equation is the definition of the absorbed dose rate at time t, we can substitute and see that the absorbed dose to the target from the source is just the integral from 0 to infinite of the activity at time t plus the sum for all the radiation type I of a contribution to the irradiation of this radiation. And this will give a mean absorbed dose in Gray in target K from source H. Then if we take that equation and we see here that we are shifting to the right the integral, because we are assuming that what is at the left of the outside of the integral does not depend on time, which is a very important assumption. So we are in fact defining the cumulated activity. So the cumulated activity is the integral of a time activity curve. So the graph here represents how the activity varies in a very general way. So there's a phase of accumulation and phase of elimination of the activity in time. And so the area under the curve is accumulated activity. And obviously, if the activity is expressed in Becquerel and the time is expressed in second, then the cumulated activity or time integral of the activity is expressed in Becquerel multiplied by seconds. Be very careful, multiplied by seconds. So if we see how the activity decreases in time, it usually decreases because, first of all, because of radioactive decay, so because of a physical half-life, the radioactivity decrease in an exponential way, as we can see here. But then, because the vector itself is washed away and has a biological half-life, so there's a second correction factor, the exponent of minus lambda bio for biologic t. And these two factors, the two exponential factors multiplied, can be added and define a parameter, lambda f, which is the effective decay constant that governs the decrease, the exponential decrease of the activity that is measured in a given patient organ tissue. By doing that, we define the effective half-life, and the effective half-life, defined here at the left, is the time after which the observed activity has been decreased by a factor 2. So this is here how, the definition of the impact of biological half-life, the impact of a physical half-life, and the definition of the effective half-life as a combination of biological and physical half-life. So it's 1 divided by the effective half-life is equal to 1 divided by the effective biological half-life plus 1 divided by the physical half-life. So if we see how to integrate that in time, so the accumulated activity is the time integral of the activity. We have here the equation in the general case where the activity decreases, is maximal at time t and decreases as a function of time with an exponential component and with a constant of lambda f. And therefore, we can easily integrate this, and the result is AH0, so the activity at time 0 in the source H, multiplied by the effective half-life divided by log 2, and so that's 1.443 multiplied by AH0 multiplied by TF. It's a very simple equation indeed to get the accumulated activity in the source H. Another very important point is the residence time. So suppose that you want to compare the accumulated activity observed in 2 patients, but when the administered activity is not the same. Now, you've been administering 300 megabec to a given patient 1 and 400 megabec to patient 2. Then obviously, if you want to compare the efficiency of the uptake in the given organ, you will have to divide the accumulated activity in each patient by the administered activity. By doing so, you're going to divide Becquerel seconds, that's accumulated activity, by Becquerel, that's the administered activity. So you end up with something that is expressed in second, it's a time, and it's called the residence time. So there's a graph here illustrating what the residence time could be. My concern is that it may be more misleading than anything else. So just remember the residence time as a way to compare the accumulated activity when you administer different activity to different patients. So we end up with a fundamental mode equation that says that the absorbed dose in the target K from source H is the accumulated activity in the source multiplied by the sum for all the radiation type I of the probability of emission, the energy, and the specific absorbed fraction. In fact, because we already considered that many factors were not varying as a function of time, we can group them, and we introduce the S value, which is the sum for the, all the particle type I of Ni, Ei, Phi, and that's S values which allow us to present the Merz simplified equation like D equal AS, as is here to the bottom left, or the absorbed dose in the target from the source per activity administered to the patient is the residence time multiplied by the S value. So as a summary, in order to get the absorbed dose, you need to assess the accumulated activity, and that is itself a 2-step process. The first one is being able to quantify the activity anywhere in the patient at different time from the injection until the moment the activity is gone. Then being able to integrate the time activity curve. So you have to fit the time activity curve and that get the integral of that to get the accumulated activity. And these two are independent, but we'll see that later. And then you have to use or compute the relevant S values. So in fact, you have three independent steps to carry out in order to get the absorbed dose. So the work of a MERD committee has been, in my opinion, mostly to give a calculation scheme for radiopharmaceutical dosimetry. In addition, they did a lot of S-value calculation for several radionuclides, several geometries, using anthropomorphic models, and the turning point is a publication of MERD pamphlet 11. So these are some illustration of the first models that were anthropomorphic mathematic models, so defined by equation. For the adult reference model to the left, then in the center, the reference pregnant woman, then some models that were published later in the years 2000 by different scientists. And this is how to use a MERD scheme. So in real life, there will be different radiation source, different region in the body where radioactivity will be present. And so we'll have to compute the absorbed dose in this different situation that obviously depend on the application. So there is one more generic equation that is in fact that the absorbed dose in a target K is the result of a contribution of the irradiation coming from different sources. So that's a sum for all the sources H of a product of accumulated activity in the source multiplied by the S value from that source to the target. And you have to sum them for all the sources. So in fact, and this is a sort of algorithm for clinical dosimetry, you can see the graph at the right, you are selecting the target where you want to compute the absorbed dose, or you just given, the order, please give me the absorbed dose in that region. So for each target of interest, you have first to identify the sources. And then for all the sources, you have to derive accumulated activity or residence time. Then you have to get the relevant source to target S values, and you have to sum all the contribution of the irradiation to target K. Then we've been talking of the S values. So the S values were published in the MERD pamphlet. So the S values are for one isotope. Then if using this model, that's what allows you to have the S value. But if for a given nuclear medicine examination, for a given radiopharmaceutical, we can add a reference pharmacokinetic for a given radiopharmaceutical, then we obtain the MERD dose estimate reports. So I think it's very important to make the difference between the MERD pamphlet that are for one isotope and the MERD dose estimate report that are for radiopharmaceutical. So this is an example of a table for technetium per techninate. And you have here, it's absorbed dose per megabecquerel administered in different organs for a reference pharmacokinetic, and the calculation is made for a reference anthropomorphic model. And that allows you to compute the effective dose. And this was present in ICRP report 80, page 73. So that's very important to remember that MERD S values are for one isotope. So all iodine 131, for in one model, you'll have the same S values. But then the MERD dose estimate reports are for radiopharmaceutical because they integrate the pharmacokinetic of a product that differs from one radiopharmaceutical to another. The new nomenclature. In the MERD pamphlet 21, the MERD committee tried to merge the nomenclature coming from ICRP and the nomenclature from the MERD primer 91, which is the one I'm using. And that defined or that introduced the nomenclature of MERD pamphlet 21. So these tables here and that one introduce the differences. I'm not entering in the detail. I'm personally still using MERD nomenclature from 1991 because it's easier, and I think it's also easier to teach. For example, you have here the exact nomenclature of MERD 1991, so D equal AS. But then in the new nomenclature, you have the introduction of a time of irradiation TD, you have radiation weighting factors, effective dose, etc. So it's already integrating ICRP values, but obviously only in the context of diagnostics. And there's also a different presentation of accumulated activity, which is a time-integrated activity, but here you have it's more complex, and the time-integrated activity coefficient, which is the residence time, is a small a with a tilde as comparison to the capital A with a tilde, which I personally find as quite confusing. So my advice is to be very careful when you're using the new nomenclature. The second advice is it's perfectly fine to use one nomenclature or another one, or you can use directly the nomenclature of ICRP, because as you can see here, now we're living with 3 different nomenclature. The only point that I'd like to make is it is important to be consistent. Don't mix the parameters of MERD pamphlet 21 with words from MERD primer 91 or ICRP. Then I'd like to mention MERD-Calc because it's ongoing work. It's not completed yet, but you can see here the evolution of that project that is going to give you in an Excel spreadsheet the possibility to do model-based calculation using the MERD S values with different models, including the pediatric models of ICRP that were recently, in 2020, recently published. Another ongoing effort that is public open doors collaboration. So it's the generation of free dosimetry resources that I'm involved in. And that's for different models, the generation of S values plus statistical uncertainties that could be freely downloadable if you want to get different sets of S values. As a conclusion, the MERD formalism is valid for both diagnostic and therapy. The MERD S values, they represent an impressive database. They can be used for diagnostic mostly easily because they are tables, and maybe in the future with MERD-Calc, it will be in Excel spreadsheet. It's mostly in radiation safety. It's always for a model. It's not for your patient. And as a reminder, because it's a very general statement, clinical dosimetry requires quantitative imaging, requires time activity curve fitting and integration, and patient-specific S value or direct calculation. It's very important to note that the MERD formalism is different from MERD S values. So you can use a MERD formalism and then compute your own S factors or S values. It's exactly what the open dose collaboration is proposing. And as a consequence, writing dosimetry was performed using the MERD formalism, as is often seen in publication, is not sufficient. You always have to say how the cumulated activity was obtained and how or which S values were selected. And I just I'd like to report on these 2 documents. This is a guidance document on good practice of clinical dosimetry reporting, and also the current trend, which is trying to assess the uncertainties whenever one is performing absorbed dose calculation in nuclear medicine. And to finish, some references that you can find in the web. So this was the first lecture of a series of 5, which are being prepared under the IAA Technical Cooperation Program and the project POL 9025. Thank you.